Hello, and welcome back to the Best for Baby podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Rogers Sargent, and today we're talking about a big topic, and that is crying in babies, and looking at some reasons why your baby is going to be crying and helping you to work out those reasons and see if they apply to your baby in each situation. And of course, I'm going to try and explain to you what to do in that situation. Now, a lot of them are the simple things. They're things you may have already Googled. They're things you may already know. But stick with it because I'm going to try and explain ways in which you can spot the crying before it happens or know when you're at risk of it coming, and what we call an early warning system that your baby has built in. So please stick with me to the end because I've got lots of information that I hope is going to be really, really helpful to you. So let's begin by looking at something really basic, and maybe so basic you haven't thought of it, but something that I hope might be reassuring to you if you are battling with your little one who just seems to be crying a huge amount. And that is to just recognize and remember that babies have no other form of communication. When they are little, babies can't use gestures, they can't use facial expressions terribly well. All they can do to let you know they want you, they need you, they're bored, something's wrong, they're uncomfortable, is to cry. And that's the only way to talk to you and get your attention. So a lot of the time, those cries are just calling you and drawing your attention to something you wouldn't otherwise know. So I found that to be quite a reassuring thing when I had a baby, to go, actually, she's not sad. I haven't failed. There's nothing wrong. That's her way of telling me, oops, something's going on here. I need something there. So maybe that's just a really minor point, but I hope it will bring you a little bit of comfort if you have been worrying that your baby does cry quite a lot. From there, we'll have a look at the big reasons which we all have considered, and you probably have learned now your babies cry for each of those things, but it's the big things. Nappy changing. Sometimes babies are really uncomfortable if they are even in just a wet nappy. Other babies are quite happy to sit in a really soiled nappy, but some of them are just telling you, I'm uncomfortable, and it's because of the nappy and it needs to be changed. There's things like they're really, really tired, and so they will cry because they need to now go to sleep, and they're letting you know that. And then, of course, there's hunger. Now, when a baby is truly hungry, they will cry incessantly until they are fed, because that is what they need in that moment. And so you might go through all the other things that I'm going to talk to you about now, all these other lovely calming techniques. But if your baby's hungry, they're going to cry, and nothing else is going to work until you feed them. And with hunger, it's important to remember that even if your baby's already into a routine of feeds and you think they're not due a feed, they could still be hungry. And that's because we're all different. We all have more hungry days than other days. But also, when babies go through growth spurts, they of course are hungrier and they need more feeding because they're growing. So even if you think, oh, they can't possibly be hungry, they might just surprise you and actually be hungry. And then that's exactly what they're going to need, is a feed, even if it's outside of their feeding time. And the other thing to say about when a baby is going through a growth spurt is that they're going to have a lot going on inside their little bodies. So they're going to be fussier and quicker to start crying than when they're not going through growth spurts. First of all, because they're feeling hungry. Second of all, they've got growth hormones that changes their whole hormonal balance. So their hormones are different to what they usually are. So that's a bit uncomfortable. Plus they've got growing. And when you're tiny, a little bit of growth is a lot. It makes a big difference in a body. And so these are all things that a baby is coping with during a growth spurt, and they're also more tired. So sometimes they need more sleep and they need more feeds. So factor that in if you think your baby shouldn't quite be hungry right now. So those are the obvious ones. The not so obvious ones, where your baby is just using crying to communicate with you, might be, first of all, because they're seeking closeness. They're seeking physical contact. Now, this is quite interesting because we think, oh, my baby's so tiny, they don't want to come and have a cuddle with me. Surely that doesn't make sense. But actually, physiologically, we all, still as adults too, but we're all driven to have and seek physical comfort through physical contact and closeness. And we know that when we do skin to skin with babies, when we cuddle them, there's a release of oxytocin in the baby as well as the caregiver. And that is such a rush of feel-good feelings for the baby that they are actually almost driven to seek it and look for it and desire the release of the oxytocin. So very often they're crying, and what they need is that release of that specific hormone, which will come through you cuddling your baby, or doing skin to skin with your baby if they're very young as well. So it's funny, we don't often consider that, but sometimes it's just their oxytocin levels have been depleted slightly, and they're literally just looking for you to cuddle them and to hold them. Now, the next thing to look at is their stimulation levels, because babies could cry, obviously if they're overstimulated, but also if they're understimulated, if they're a bit bored. Now, we know as research is emerging with older children how important it is for them to be a bit bored and to enable them to have time to go off and dream and play and all of those things on their own. But the little babies, if they are bored, they are going to start crying. And it's important that we then give them the stimulation they need. And that stimulation might be through cuddling, or it might be through doing play with them, taking a toy and showing them, moving it from side to side so they just track it, and doing some tummy time. It might be in a really little baby, just holding them against your body in a sort of upright position. It might be singing to them. It might be talking with them or showing them a book or showing them their reflection in a mirror, and that might be enough for them, but they just need that additional little bit of stimulation to feel comfortable and to feel happy. Now, sensory stimulation is very unique to each person, and what we see is some people have a greater need for stimulation and some people have a much lesser need for it. And as we get older, we are in control of that. So you might be someone who has a really high sensory threshold, and so you make sure you get a lot of sensory stimulation in order to feel adequately stimulated, to feel comfortable, so that you're not understimulated, basically. And sometimes that might be your voice. You speak very loudly, you laugh loudly. It might be that you run a lot, or you're very sporty, you're very active. It might be you're just really busy and you're always doing something and your hands are always moving. It might be you love crunchy foods. You know, all of these things that we just find ways to give ourselves the sensory stimulation we need, where babies can't. So they're dependent on us to give it to them. And sometimes we give them too much, because we are people who want a lot of stimulation. So our voices are like this and we are moving and bouncing them, and they feel completely overstimulated because, number one, they're a baby. But it's even worse if they are a baby with a very little threshold and they're going to go on to be someone who doesn't like a lot of stimulation. Then those are the babies that are going to get overstimulated far quicker. And then it makes sense that when they're crying because they're overstimulated, we need to give less stimulation, remove something that is upsetting them so that they can then calm down. And we're going to get into this in a lot more detail in just a moment, but I just want to finish off the reasons for crying with the really serious cry that you will know is quite different. So the reasons that we may see serious cries is obviously if they've got extreme discomfort, which is usually coming from within, and that can be because they've got gas or trapped wind, or they might have what we call colic. So that's internal discomfort because their organs are uncomfortable because they've got the gas, or constipation or something like that, that's really just constantly triggering it and keeping it on a loop like that. Of course, reflux is a major one. And sometimes people say, but my baby doesn't have reflux, nothing comes out of their mouth. And it's not that. They can have silent reflux, which is where the content of the stomach is moving up out of the stomach and into the esophagus, where it shouldn't be, because that contains stomach acid. The stomach is quite ready to have acid in it, but the esophagus isn't. So when that little sphincter hasn't yet closed nice and tightly, which lots of babies, it can take a long time until it does. And so what happens is that the stomach contents escapes up into the esophagus and it burns, and it's incredibly painful for them. And what we see with these kind of extreme discomforts is it is a different kind of cry. And the same goes for when there's a medical condition, when your baby is ill, sometimes even when your baby is teething later on. It can be really painful and really uncomfortable. And this is where we need to seek help. This isn't just, using these gentle calming techniques I'm going to show you, or changing a nappy or giving a feed. That's not going to cut it, because there's something much greater going on. And usually this is a different cry in that it sounds different. It's not their norm. So it comes on and it doesn't go away terribly quickly. They can reach stages where they're inconsolable for hours at a time. And you will know. I don't have to actually even explain it to you. You will know this is not your normal cry, and really you should intervene. There's the 3 rule, which I don't totally agree with, but it's something you can keep in the back of your mind, where they say if a baby cries for more than 3 hours, 3 times a week or more, and this lasts for 3 weeks, you should get help. Now, I think that's waiting quite long. I would always get help a lot sooner. If I find my baby's crying for 3 hours more than once, and it seems to be a pattern that's now started and they're continuing crying, I would certainly get help. So that's just something for you to bear in mind, that that's usually when there's something more going on and it actually needs medical attention to help them. So hopefully you now have a good awareness of what is, normal, what we call developmental crying. Where it happens, it's your baby communicating, and I'm going to help you to start identifying the needs in terms of stimulation. But you will know if it's not that really strong cry where they're in extreme discomfort, it's a cry that will stop if you give them the right thing that they're asking for. So the only real major cry that is really difficult but yet developmental, and not actually a medical need, is, some people call them the witching hours, and you may have heard of that. And that is usually just your baby being overstimulated. And that is why the witching hour tends to be towards the end of the day, because your baby is both overstimulated from all the stimulation they've had throughout the day, as well as overtired. And when those 2 factors come together, the baby becomes inconsolable and cries and cries. And usually those babies after the witching hour will crash. So it's end of the day when there's been a lot of stimulation, when they're tired, and then suddenly they just crash, boom, and they're fast asleep. And then what we would say is, if that's what you're recognizing in your baby, that crying may last a few hours and it can keep happening, but it's not a medical reason, then it's probably overstimulation. And of course, if your baby is crying incessantly like this, and it's not always at the same time of day, then it's more likely to be a medical condition. So with the witching hour, we know it's an overstimulation thing. So then we need to look at decreasing the stimulation you're giving during the day, and particularly in that moment, reducing the stimulation that is coming at them, that is making them so wound up and overtired. And we know what happens here is that these babies, when they are overtired, with or without the overstimulation, their body starts to secrete cortisol and adrenaline, and they're almost going to like a fight or flight state, which is the opposite of what they need to be in order to fall asleep. So then they can't fall asleep. And this is why we see an overtired baby is unable to fall asleep. And so it's essential there that we stop whatever's triggering that fight or flight, whatever triggering that release of adrenaline, and calm them in order to get them to be able to eventually fall asleep. But what I said before, if you don't have those skills, your baby's going to cry and cry and cry until they have overshot their level of stimulation by so far, their little systems cannot cope anymore, and they will crash instantly and just fall asleep. And that's okay. We're all parents, we're doing our best, and it's okay if that happens. But ideally, you would like to pull them back before they reach that stage. And once it just starts, we can bring them down in a more natural way and enable them to sleep. So in order to do that, we need to understand baby states and their levels of arousal. Now, this is something that we factor in, knowing that some babies like more stimulation than other babies, or some babies can handle more stimulation than others. So there are 2 things to look at when we are looking at adequately giving stimulation or needing to remove stimulation from our babies. And the clue is often in the cry or the sleep habits. Your baby may be battling to fall asleep, but they're not crying hysterically. They're just really having a tough time falling asleep, and that's your understimulated baby. And they may have given you clues throughout the day that they are understimulated because they've had their little niggling cry that a bit of stimulation has resolved. Or your overstimulated baby who is crying hysterically at the end of the day and then they crash. So those are the two kind of extreme pictures, and of course your baby may fit somewhere in the middle there. And then what we have to look at is what I said, the behavioral states of babies that they all have. Now this was something that was described by an American pediatrician in the 70s, Dr. Brazelton, and he did a lot of amazing work and research in babies and sort of came up with assessments that professionals can use to assess babies effectively. But one of the things that is incredibly helpful to parents to know is the behavioral states. Now, he found that all babies have 6 states of being, and it goes from zero stimulation, where they are in deep sleep, all the way to where they are overstimulated and crying as a result of overstimulation. So we do have this kind of niggle cry, which is because of understimulation or because they are bored, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about the proper overstimulated cry, and that is the 6th state, and there are the states in between. So in deep sleep, if we think about it, this is where babies are completely still. They're not moving. The mouth may fall open. You hear that deep, slow, calm breathing. Nothing is moving. That's your deep sleep, where you know if something makes a noise, my baby's not going to wake up. Then they have light sleep. Now, in light sleep, babies are still moving. The tiny babies have something called general movements. There's 2 types depending on the baby's age, but those general movements are close to the body. They're small, so they're not still, but they're not big movements, to oversimplify. We also will see the eyes moving under the eyelids because this is when they have the rapid eye movement sleep. So we see the eyes moving and the breathing rate might still be quite quick. So have a look at your baby very quickly. You're going to know which state is which. Then the 3rd state is drowsiness. So this is just before your baby falls asleep. So if they are drowsy, if you suddenly start stimulating them now, they're probably going to go straight to crying because what they want is no stimulation. They want to go to sleeping. But if you remove stimulation or enable them to calm, you're going to get them into their sleeping states. You know, when a baby's drowsy, they start blinking really slowly and they might yawn, they might be rubbing their eyes, giving you all those kind of cues that you can see they're ready for a snooze, they're getting drowsy. Then we have 3 states of being awake. You have the optimum state, which we call calm alert. And this is because that's exactly what babies are. They're calm, but they're alert. So they are available for learning. They can take in anything that you're giving to them. So this is when you play with your baby. You give them all the lovely stimulation and show them things and do your skin to skin in this state. And this is in their calm alert state. And we can see this because a baby's got similar movements to the baby in light sleep. Those little general movements I described before, where the arms and the legs are orientated towards the body and they're not doing big movements. It's just small movements, or they might be quite still, but they won't be still for the entire time. Even in light sleep, they won't be still for the entire time. They've got these constant little movements. The other key is the little mouth is usually an O shape, as they're looking and learning, and the eyes are bright and alert when they are in this lovely state. And we want to keep them there as long as possible because that's how they're going to learn more. The longer they're in that state, the longer they're going to feel regulated and calm. Now, the state after this is what we call active alert, which just means they are now starting to have had enough stimulation. You need to stop stimulating them, and they are active now because that is their way to show you, I've had enough, stop stimulating me. And here, the little movements of the arms and legs get bigger. So they might stretch their arms out, they might start to kick the legs a little bit more strongly. Very often they may push one hand out and it's almost like a go away hand. Get away from me, pushing you away. We might see them starting to press backwards with their bodies. They might start scrunching up their faces. They are no longer resting and calm and interested. Their eyes are curling up, they're grimacing. They're starting to show you, if we keep going the way we are, I'm going to start crying. I'm going to be overstimulated. I'm going to move in the final state, which is crying. So when your baby starts to show you those cues, the idea is that you stop what you're doing, you remove that stimulation, you get them back into the calm alert state, and you continue with whatever it was you were doing. As your babies get older, it won't just be feeding or skin to skin, and therefore the play that you're doing can become overstimulating very quickly. Whereas if you're just doing skin to skin or feeding, it's unlikely that you're going to have to stop and calm the baby, because usually you would use skin to skin or feeding to calm them. So this is for the slightly older babies, where we start to notice we're doing something, we're doing an activity, a play activity, we're doing tummy time, something like that. And now they're starting to show me I've had enough. Therefore, if it's been a short window, let's calm them and go back to it. So we can maximize the time spent in the calm alert state. Or I know we're done here. If we keep going, we are going to end up crying. So let's just give my baby time out until they move to a drowsy state and go back to sleep. So you can work up and down those states, trying to keep your baby in the calm alert stage as long as possible when they are starting to give you signals that they've had enough. Of course, when your baby's in deep sleep or light sleep, don't do anything. Protect those windows, because both of those states are really important. They're important for brain development, for growth. The light sleep consolidates all the movements they've done in the day and cements the learning from those movements. And the deep sleep kind of prunes any unnecessary neural connections that have been made. So it cleans up and tidies the brain, and that's also when they release their growth hormones. So it's essential that they are in deep sleep and in light sleep. So we don't do anything. What we don't want is to inadvertently bring them out of deep sleep into light sleep by giving stimulation. So that's your really noisy environment. You want to protect the deep sleep by not letting there be any sudden loud noises that will wake them and bring them into light sleep. And when they're in light sleep, you really want to be protective, because those sudden loud noises are going to bring them straight to crying and wake them up very suddenly. They can shoot past a few states and go straight to crying. So we always protect sleep time. I love white noise and I love blackout blinds, because it's just that removal of stimulation that can keep them in the sleep state where they're getting all their benefits from sleep. That said, I do have another episode I did on sleep, so please do listen to that, because I talk about day-night cycles and how we're less precious about protecting sleep during the day and we're more concerned about it at night, particularly if your baby hasn't yet created a day-night cycle. So have a listen to that. But it's just something to bear in mind that when we use white noise and blackout blinds, it removes that stimulation. So if we look then at some babies who like a lot of stimulation, some who don't like a lot of stimulation, and how that all factors into these states, well, what we're going to see is that we may get to the end of the day with a baby who is completely overstimulated because they've had too much and their threshold is too low for them to cope with it. And so you have to just start by reducing the stimulation you're giving them during the day, and where they are upset and crying, to remove any kind of stimulation that you can see that might be too strong. And the other thing to consider is any sudden changes in stimulation is going to be almost like a trigger to release that adrenaline. So it might be that you have a sudden loud laugh, or you start singing and you have a voice a bit like mine. It's quite jarring, and it changes, it varies. I talk suddenly and then I stop talking, and then it goes fast and then I laugh, and you might suddenly cough, and all of that is just on an already overstimulated little system, too much for the baby. So we want to reduce that variety in what we're seeing, the sudden change in the way it is at the moment. Because remember, babies have also come out of a womb where everything is the same all the time. The temperature doesn't change, the light doesn't change because they're in a water balloon. So there's nothing hard and sharp, and they've got this constant sort of squeezy deep pressure, which is very calming for them. And so when we introduce them to the world, it's very easy for all babies, not even those with a low threshold, to get overstimulated really quickly because everything is a sudden change. Even going out with your baby, they've got wind blowing on them, bright daylight. And these are really essential things for a baby, because without those things, they're not going to sleep as well, because that helps them to create their day-night cycles. However, it needs to be done gradually and slowly and not too much in one go. And if you as a parent have a really high sensory threshold, you might be out and about all the time, singing, laughing, skipping, bouncing your baby, all of this, and they get to the end of the day and they're completely overwhelmed and it's too much, and we hit the witching hour. So what you want to look at is remembering not a lot of change. Let them have longer periods where everything is quite samey, no massive changes. And yes, go out because sunlight and fresh air is essential, but is it going to be when you go out, it's prime time and there's a million children screaming and shouting all around the baby? Or if that's all you can do, come home and have a quiet moment after that. So we're looking at reducing that stimulation so that we're not left with that baby who is crying incessantly at the end of the day and really battling. Of course, I said the witching hour is the combination of that overstimulation and overtiredness. So you also need to get your naps right. And if your baby isn't napping correctly during the day and sleeping overnight enough, what you're going to find is it's going to be very tricky, even by sorting out your stimulation, to address that witching hour. So go have a listen to the podcast on sleep, or if you're really battling, get help. Reach out to me, reach out to a sleep consultant, your midwife. There's a lot of options, but get sleep correct in order to really tackle that overstimulated baby at the end of the day. Now, we don't only remove stimulation, we also need to introduce calming stimulation. Now, calming stimulation is lovely because it's giving baby stimulation, but it's not raising their level. It's not making them go over their threshold, and it's not making them go up a state closer to crying. It's taking them closer to drowsy and then to sleep if we introduce calming stimulation. Now, calming stimulation, I've spoken quickly about the womb, and it's anything that kind of recreates the womb. So it's the deep pressure. So putting your baby in a stretchy fabric sling and having them there against you is that lovely squeezy deep pressure. That's a really good one. Another really nice way, if your baby is definitely under 6 months, but perhaps sort of 3 to 4 months and under, it's going to be more effective, is swaddling them, because that deep pressure is incredibly calming for a baby. Swaddling has to be done correctly though, so please go to my website. I'll put the link in the show notes, but there's a free tutorial on how to swaddle your baby. Please watch that, because if you get swaddling wrong, it does not help, and a lot of babies hate it. If you get it right, it's incredibly helpful because it gives that nice deep pressure, and we can see these babies going from the highest state, that's crying, screaming, to really just calming and gently drifting off to sleep, as opposed to crashing and falling asleep. So swaddling is a really nice one. That deep pressure touch also comes with the cuddling and the holding, and that's really soothing. So sometimes your baby may have a niggle cry because they're looking for the oxytocin rush of a cuddle, but sometimes just holding your baby and giving them a deep pressure squeeze is actually going to take them from the real cry, the big cry, in state 6, because it's the calming deep pressure of it. At the same time, when you're cuddling and holding your baby, they will be touching part of your bare skin, and we know bare skin on a baby's bare skin, massively soothing, oxytocin, all of that is going to calm them, but also they're going to smell you, and that's familiar, and the familiarity is another thing that is calming for a baby. When you are cuddling your baby, what we often naturally do as well, which is why cuddling works so well, because it takes in a lot of different calming sensory things, is we hum or we shush our babies. Now, as I said, if you have the jarring voice like mine, that's not going to be helpful. But if you sing really low or you hum, you're going to create vibration in your chest. And if you're holding your baby against you, they're going to feel that vibration. Even now, while I'm talking, I've got my hand on my chest, and with my high, sort of annoying voice, shall we say, I can feel that vibration. But if I make sure I talk in a deeper voice and I keep talking, I don't just stop and start, I talk in this kind of a rhythm, that vibration keeps going in my chest, and it's nice and predictable, and it will be soothing for the baby, which is why we use vibration in older children as a really good sensory input for children who need additional sensory stimulation, because it's calming. But vibration tools in the tiny babies are very, very strong. So just that nice deep kind of talking, the way I said, or humming, and creating that vibration in your chest that they're going to feel. And also the way a sound wave moves is like a vibration as well. That's going to be calming for them. So practice that and see the difference in your own voice so that you are sure you get it right. Often lots of people will say to me, oh, the father of the baby will just start talking, or he'll just hold the baby and start singing. The baby falls asleep instantly. And it's because men have that much deeper voice, which creates far more vibration and is therefore far more soothing to the baby very often than some female voices that aren't quite so deep and calming for a baby. Then we look at movement as a calming stimulation. Now, movement can be very excitatory, very stimulatory, and have a beautiful role in a child who is understimulated during the day, or just in general stimulation during the day. But when we've got a child who is crying, we can use movement if it is predictable, if it is rhythmical, and relatively slow. So you would never use acceleration. So if you think of a child in a swing, you can swing them and they can get into a rhythm where they can now start to predict what it's going to feel like. There's no sudden change in that rhythm. Or when you suddenly push them, they accelerate, and that they go, whee! It's like a sudden big body response to it, a sudden big stimulation. So what we want to do is when our child is overstimulated and we now want to rock them to calm them, you don't want to bounce them frantically. You don't want to bounce them fast and use acceleration and kind of keep eliciting a startle reflex or just make them feel more overwhelmed. What you want to be doing is using really soothing, predictable, calming movement. A nice way to do that is with a little baby, you could possibly do it on your own in a blanket, hold them in a blanket and rock them, because remember they sink into the blanket and then it's stretchy and it also gives them that nice deep pressure. But ideally between two people, and one person holds the two top corners of the stretchy blanket, the other person holds the bottom two corners. The person at the top, at the head end of the baby, makes sure that the head is slightly higher than the chest and the bottom, so that the baby's definitely not lying with their head pointing downwards. You want them on a slight incline, and you gently rock the baby and soothe them in that way in the blanket. You can, of course, also lie them on their tummies on a ball and rock a ball. Again, it's got to be slow and predictable. I'm talking about those big pregnancy balls, the gym balls. And what we want to make sure we're avoiding is rolling them too far forward so that their head goes downwards and is below the level of their body. So really what you will do is put the baby lying on their tummy on the top of the ball, rock them backwards and back to the middle, backwards and back to the middle. And it's a gentle movement there. Another thing, if they are crying, you can hold your baby, give them a firm cuddle and bounce on the gym ball in a rhythmical, relatively slow pattern where there's no sudden acceleration. That is a really lovely way to give calming stimulation and therefore take them out of their crying state. So this is where movement and deep pressure usually go hand in hand naturally from the way you carry out the calming movement stimulation. But it also makes sense why when you put your baby in a sling or in the pushchair and you take them for a walk, they calm, they stop crying, or they fall asleep. So these are all tools that we use for inducing sleep and also getting out of a crying state. And ideally, you would take your baby, your overstimulated, overtired baby, at least to a drowsy state, and then try and put them to sleep. because we're trying to eliminate the number of times that they are going from crying to crashing to being fast asleep. If we look, on the other hand, at your understimulated baby, these are your babies who sometimes avoid stimulation, so they're very still because they don't have a great threshold. But those are usually the babies that, if they have a small sensory threshold, they're going to be overstimulated by the end of the day. Whereas your babies with a big sensory threshold, who are always looking for more stimulation, are going to reach the end of the day understimulated. So they're not going to have a witching hour necessarily. I mean, they might get really upset by it because it may be uncomfortable for them, but they tend to, instead of having witching hours, really battle to fall asleep. And firstly, this is often again with a mismatch. If you are a parent who has a very low sensory threshold, so you're a lot calmer and you talk softly and you're quieter and you naturally are going to be going out and rushing about a lot less than someone with the highest sensory threshold that is constantly used to moving about quickly like this and taking the baby along with them. So you might find that your baby has this desire to be moved around a lot more during the day and you don't. So there's a mismatch there. In which case we come to the end of the day and the baby just can't sleep because they haven't filled up their little sensory bucket. They haven't had enough stimulation in the daytime. They're not ready for sleep. They can still get overtired trying to fall asleep and not being able to, then elicits the whole adrenaline release and cortisol release. And so you go on to a different cascade for a slightly different reason. So what we want to do is, before it's bedtime, before the last feed, sometimes even before bath time, we want to give them enough movement stimulation. Movement is usually a really good one because it will tick the box much quicker than trying to give all the other types of stimulation to make up for what they've missed on the day. If we give them some really big movement stimulation where you move their whole body through space, we're likely to make them feel like they've had enough stimulation before bed. Now, we want to make sure it's the calming movement stimulation, not the excitatory, because that's going to set them off and more than likely make them overstimulated or get them all excited and not ready for sleep. So we want to set the scene. We don't do it to put them to sleep. Sometimes we do use these strategies if we are desperate and battling and our babies can't sleep. But we're talking about babies we know that have been just take a really, really long time to fall asleep. We try and introduce this, as I said, before the feed or even sometimes before bath time. And again, it's the same thing. It's the rocking. Sometimes I say to parents, if you can, between two of you, rock that little baby in the stretchy blanket for like 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes if you can. Just rocking nice and calmly. Or putting them in a little baby swing, that so long as you can make sure there's no quick accelerations, nothing that's going to get the startle reflex elicited, nice and soft and gentle, or do the bouncing on the ball, or put them in the sling and go for a walk. We add in more of those things that are comfortable for you as a parent to do through the day if possible. And then at nighttime, they've had more movement stimulation, and then you give them their bath and their feed, and so they should drift off to sleep a little bit easier. Other little things during the day are challenging them with their movements and doing more tummy time, because it's a bit of a gym workout for a little baby. And the more tummy time you can do, the more they're going to feel like they've had enough movement stimulation and physical exertion in order to fall asleep. For this reason, sometimes we see children who have slight gross motor delays, so the babies who are delayed in sitting, rolling, crawling, all these things, because they're not getting enough movement stimulation for their age, even if their sensory threshold isn't a threshold that would cause them to need more movement stimulation before bed or to go to bed understimulated, what we find, because they themselves can't rely on their bodies to give themselves enough stimulation, they are the children who will then need this kind of movement stimulation at night. So if you do find that your baby is maybe a bit delayed in attaining gross motor milestones, and you're also battling to get them to fall asleep, very often this is a lovely quick fix, and we just make sure we give them enough movement stimulation during the day. And as I said, that's putting them in a sling and going for a walk is a big one for them, or rocking them, swinging them, bouncing them, that kind of thing, doing the tummy time during the day. Even if it's a tiny little baby, doing side lying during the day, because it's totally different and they have to do some balancing. And all of that helps to make sure that they've had enough stimulation through the day. So The take-home message here is that your baby can cry for a lot of reasons. Sometimes it's a really strong reason of discomfort or illness, and you will know by that incessant cry that is impossible to soothe, and that's when you need to get help. There's other times when there's the main things that we all know to check for, and by just doing those things, changing the nappy, adjusting the temperature, or allowing them to go to sleep or feeding them will help. And then other times it seems like it's looking for a cuddle, or it's boredom, or it's overstimulation. And that we start to look at depending on what cues they are showing you. They will show you what state they are in. And as you get to know your baby, you will learn their states and you will learn what they look like in their states. And once you start to respond to what they are showing you, you're going to see a baby who spend longer times in the calm, alert state. So that's going to be, in general, a slightly happier baby with less crying because they're in that state more and they are feeling like their needs are being met because you are preempting them by reading their cues and their signals. And those babies will then also hopefully be sleeping better. And so we are regulating them because babies can't regulate themselves. So we regulate them from an early stage by giving them exactly what they want based on what they are telling us. So you can just practice getting to know them, getting to know your babies and what your baby does, and see what you can do in those states. And then, of course, what you're going to do in the daytime in general to make sure they are getting the right stimulation for themselves based on what their end of day is like, because that will tell you where you are at in terms of the right amount of stimulation for your baby. So check out my previous episode on sleep, as well as my link on swaddling, because I think all of these things can come together and hopefully eliminate some of the crying if you haven't been able to do that before now. So yes, please do go and have a look. It's physiobaby.co.uk and all the links will be in the show notes. Please send me any comments. If you are battling, drop me an email, get in touch with me through the website, or put a comment on here. I'd love any ratings, any reviews, any comments. I'd love to hear what you people think, and where you need more help. And with that, I'm wishing you all the very best and all the best for your baby.